my good friend from the Al Jazeera Network, Ali Velshi. Ali, good to have you back on, man.
John, you are too kind to me. Thank you. Good to be back with you.
I just tell the truth. It's easy to do. It's a habit. Everybody else in the media is so afraid of it. That's why I TiVo your show every night. By the way, I did stay up last night to once again watch my Houston Astros crush the Angels. And now we're back in first place. I'm so excited we're going to the playoffs, I think. Okay, Ali, there's been a lot of talk the last week, but the one guy to really break this down, a big change in position for the Turkish government as it relates to ISIS and Syria, maybe troops. Yeah. You know, Turkey has the biggest army in NATO outside of the United States.
Huge, yeah.
They've sat on the sidelines. Tell our audience what changed and what the ramifications are.
All right, so a little bit of context. Turkey is a NATO member. It's the only Muslim country in NATO, and it has the largest army, as you said, in NATO, including a particularly effective air force. Turkey has long wanted to become part of the European Union. Europe's not interested. It wants Turkey for its strategic location and its army, but Europe doesn't really want to get too chummy with a Muslim country. So the net result is, over the last few years, Turkey has gone from a fully secular, Western-facing nation. It's turned east into a country that flexes its muscle in the Muslim world, and it's become much more chummy with its Muslim neighbors. It borders Syria and it borders Iraq. Now, here's the problem: northern Syria and northern Iraq are ISIL-controlled areas. So Syria has this massive boundary with Iraq and Syria, and the West has been trying to get it to cooperate more in the fight against ISIL. It's basically said no until now. Now it's saying that it is going to let its NATO base, Incirlik, which is a very important strategic base, be used by Americans to strike ISIL targets, particularly in Syria, but possibly in Iraq. Now, that's the good part. We got Turkey on side in the fight against ISIL. The bad part is that Turkey doesn't worry as much about ISIL as we do. To them, ISIL is a new problem. Their old problem is the Kurds. They've got this Kurdish minority, which for decades has wanted its own country, or at least autonomy. The Kurds are the most effective fighting force in Syria and Iraq. Remember when the American-trained Iraqi army cut and ran? It was the Kurdish Peshmerga that stuck around and has been keeping ISIL at bay. That's the problem. We've now got Turkey in on the fight against ISIL, but they're also bombing these Kurds who are our allies in the region. So it's once again another example of, the enemy of my friend is not necessarily my enemy. It all gets very complicated in the Middle East, and this has made it yet murkier.
I tell you, what a mess it is. So what do you think we ought to do? I mean, obviously the Turks are obsessed with deposing Assad for the reasons that President Assad, the reason that you mentioned. Anybody who listens to my show knows that I've been an advocate, I think, of not an advocate of the Assad regime, just an advocate that I think that Assad should be our ally in this battle instead of our enemy. But this really puts everybody now in an awkward position because, as you say, they're bombing our allies along with our enemies.
Yeah, so we're trying to convince Turkey, and when I say we, meaning NATO countries are trying to convince Turkey to say, could you go easy on the Kurdish side of things? So Turkey and NATO have decided that they're going to make a 60-mile buffer zone in northern Syria, which basically is because Turkey has 1.8 million refugees from Syria. This is causing problems in Turkey. So they want to have this buffer zone, a safe place for Syrians to go. Well, guess what? The Assad regime doesn't like that because they don't want a NATO and Turkey-administered zone in their country, and ISIL doesn't want that because that's the zone from which these so-called moderate militias, which we support, are going to operate from. So now we've created a weird situation where the Assad regime and ISIS may be unified against this NATO-Turkey alliance in northern Syria. So it's kind of one of those things that before you shoot someone in northern Syria, you need to ask for their ID and figure out who they're allied with to determine whether they're friend or foe. It is very complicated, and unless Turkey decides that it puts its battle with the Kurds on the back burner and focuses on ISIL, that's going to be a problem. The issue is in Turkey, in Ankara, in the capital. Turkey is a Sunni country. ISIL is a Sunni group. There are some people who are actually sympathetic sympathetic to what ISIL is doing. The other thing is ISIL is smuggling its oil through Turkey, which is benefiting some Turks. So we are at cross purposes here. The U.S. and NATO want different things out of this fight in the Middle East than Turkey does, and that's a problem. Everybody's going to have to sit down and say, what do we want? Do we want to depose Assad? Do we want Assad as an ally? What exactly are our goals? Because right now everybody's just armed and shooting each other in that region.
Why won't the U.S. bring Assad into the dialogue?
The problem that the U.S. has, if you remember, the turning point in U.S. public opinion about Assad was when we discovered and saw those videotapes of what he was doing to his own people. We in the Western world have some red lines, and when you assassinate, you kill your own people, when you commit things that look like genocide, it generally turns our stomachs, and we say we can't have those people as allies, and people will remind you of the Holocaust, and they'll remind you what the Turks did to the Armenians, and they remind you that in Rwanda and in Yugoslavia, we sort of stood aside while we knew innocent people were being killed. And that's sort of the principled position which stops the Americans from being on the side of the Assad regime. The political position is that the Assad regime are Alawite Muslims. That is an offshoot of Shia Islam. They are supported by the Russians and the Iranians. So in this proxy war that is the United States, propping up a pro-Shia regime, a pro-Russian and pro-Iranian regime is not on the political agenda, particularly of the neocons in the United States.
What's the pathway, in your judgment, to resolving this so that there's a united front against what everybody sees as the real threat, which is ISIS?
Well, look, I think, and I don't really want to make recommendations about whether Assad is better than ISIL. I will say this. The Assad regime is a government. I think things are more readily solved politically than militarily, and at least with a government, there's a chance that you can sit down and you can meet and negotiate. ISIL has no desire to do that. They want what they want. They want their Islamic caliphate, their Islamic regime. They're not particularly interested in what the West thinks about the whole thing, and they're willing to open up on all fronts. A government tends to be a more strategic enterprise. They tend to be open to, you give me this versus we give you this. So in the same way that I've sort of supported the concept of a deal with Iran because I think negotiations are better than not having negotiations, it may be worth the U.S. Approaching the Assad regime and saying, how do we solve this problem before the whole thing comes unwound and we've got an uncontainable problem in the Middle East? In other words, the Assad regime may be more containable than ISIL is.
Ali, you had a column up the other day that I saw that I read on the economic impact for Iranians of this deal that we made, which is going to go through. There's no way Congress is going to get 2/3 to override Obama's veto, even if it is deep six in the first round. The economic impact to Iran, how does that affect the balance now in the Middle East?
Well, here's the important thing to understand. The sanctions definitely got Iran to the table. There's absolutely no question that they were effective on that front. The problem is, and I was there, as you know, for 2 weeks, the problem is that they disproportionately affect the lower and middle classes. They don't really affect upper classes enough. Why? Because these people have interplay between the West. They travel. They've got bank accounts elsewhere. They've got business dealings. And remember, when there are sanctions, there are always people in an economy who benefit from them, right? They benefit from the fact that some things are not readily available. So if you can deal in those auto parts or certain foods, you do better. The elites have done very well in Iran. It's a bit of a democracy, but largely it's an autocracy. So the net result is that poor, lower income, less educated people have developed a greater distrust than they already had for the West, and they support the hardliners and the conservatives who wanted no deal in Iran. So the longer it goes on, while it creates hardship for some Iranians, it strengthens the hardliner position, making a deal more elusive the further down the road you go. And I think that was an important takeaway. The general population didn't harbor an innate distrust for the West and for America and Israel. There was some, and it's strong, there's no question, but it can be changed. So I always thought that the longer we wait to get a deal, the less likely that we were going to get a deal. You'll notice in Iran there's a major battle going on right now between the hardliners and conservatives versus the reformist and and the liberals. And one thing that Americans don't notice when they see Hassan Rouhani, who is a cleric, is that he was the reformist candidate. He's the liberal. He's much less conservative than Mahmoud Ahmadinejad actually was. So the sanctions had their effect. There's no question that without the sanctions, Iran would not have been at the table making a deal. Whether or not the sanctions would continue to have their the same effect, and whether or not we could even keep the sanctions regime together, is what was the big doubt.
So what happens now?
Well, what happens now is that the same battle that's going on here in the United States, you saw these hearings at Congress yesterday about whether or not this is a good deal or a bad deal, is happening in Iran. So you're seeing the Ayatollah actually tweeting out that our policies versus Israel and versus the United States and versus the Sunni world are not going to change. They're still evil, aggressive people, but we're going to be able to get our sanctions lifted and our economy is going to improve. That's the argument going on in Iran. The Ayatollah will probably win because he's the Ayatollah. He doesn't need Congress to give him two-thirds of a majority. Congress was pretty heated yesterday, but they had John Kerry and Ernest Moniz, the Energy Secretary, and Secretary Lew, the Treasury Secretary, giving some pretty good answers. I think you're right that they won't win the first round in Congress, meaning they won't get approval. The president will veto it, and he'll have enough. They won't have enough to override the veto. The deal goes through. Remember that it is important that by the end of the year, nothing happens. No sanctions get lifted until the International Atomic Energy Agency says Iran has started to comply with its part of the deal. Then the sanctions get lifted, and we see if there's a new world starting January 2016.
And then what's going to be really interesting if we get a new president in January 2017, and it's one of the Republicans, like, for instance, Donald Trump says the first day he's there, he'll change the deal. So that'll be interesting to see if they can do anything at all. We're out of time. I want to thank Ali Velshi for being with us, Al Jazeera America. Don't miss his show On Target, 10:30 p.m. every night, Monday to Friday, 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Al Jazeera America.